Craigslist is not something I would use often. I mean, less than once a year for sure. But sometimes it's just the easiest way to sell something that would otherwise be impossible to sell quickly. However, after this happened to me about 3 years ago, I never used Craigslist again. I was 22 at the time and lived in a very small house with a roommate of mine for over a year before he moved out. The lease ended in a few months anyways, and without a roommate to split the rent with, I could no longer afford the property. Thus, I had to move out as well. It wasn't too hard to find an apartment, but it was way smaller than the house was. This meant that I pretty much needed to get rid of all of my furniture. The couch was basically unused, and my roommate and I bought it just over a year ago when he moved in, so it would be a total waste to just put it on the side of the road for someone to pick up. The thing was expensive, and I could really use any extra money to help with the move, so of course I resorted to Craigslist. This was my first time ever selling anything on the site, as I was always the one to buy stuff instead. I'd never had any weird experiences, aside from just the awkward feeling of being in someone else's house and meeting a stranger. Though, being the person selling this time, I felt much more comfortable since I would be at my house. Anyway, it took a bit over 2 weeks for someone who was seriously interested to reply to the ad and ask to come check it out. He ended up calling me to ask a few questions about it. Honestly, it made me feel better, since I assumed he was probably just trying to be safe and make sure I wasn't some creep. His name was David, and he told me that he moved into a new house and needed some cheap furniture to fill the space. I mentioned that I was in the exact opposite position, leaving my house for an apartment. He responded, asking politely why I was leaving, to which I told him that my roommate left, so I couldn't really afford it anymore. He sounded nice though, which I guess made me tell him more than I should have. We set a time after we were both off of work on a Saturday evening around 6 o'clock. When that time came around, I left the front door open and waited. I sat on the couch for over an hour just waiting for the guy to show up before eventually shutting the front door and going to the kitchen to make some food, assuming he just bailed on me. But then the doorbell rang only minutes later. It was 7:30 at this point, so I was obviously a little upset, but I tried to fake a smile and opened the door. "Hey, I'm David," he said as he held his hand out for a handshake. He was a tall, larger man with a very large grin on his face. I shook his hand and invited him inside, showing him into the living room. He looked at it for a second, nodding his head in approval, before I heard footsteps outside the front door, followed by it opening and 2 more men walking inside. "Sorry, these are my buddies that are moving in with me. Hope you don't mind." "Oh, yeah, that's fine," I said nervously, knowing that there wasn't much I could do about it. Honestly, I was starting to get really uneasy though, and had a bad feeling in my gut. I tried to not think about it, telling myself I was overthinking it, but my feelings would not suppress. David walked to the other side of the couch and knelt down a bit as if he was inspecting something. Then he stood back up. "What's this over here?" he said, pointing down at the side of the couch. With the other 2 men standing behind me, I reluctantly walked over to where he was standing and looked down at the couch. "I don't see anything." He pointed again, as if he wanted me to get down and look. The 2 other men came closer, standing in front of me, while David was behind me. Slowly, I knelt down and looked at the side, still not seeing anything. I could feel all of them breathing over me, making me feel powerless and terrified. "I'm just messing with ya. There's nothing there," David exclaimed, giving me a hard pat on the back as I stood up. I let out a nervous chuckle and moved myself a few steps away. I could see the other men had creepy smiles on their faces as they looked at David as if plotting something. I tried my best to remain calm and think of a way out of this situation, but they were in my house. I couldn't just leave, and I was too scared to ask them to leave. "So, do you like it?" I asked, trying to speed up this process. David looked at his friends and then back at me. His happy, smiling expression had shifted. There was a very odd moment of silence as I stared into David's empty eyes. A calm before the storm. One of the men tackled me to the ground, pinning me down aggressively. My instant reaction to resist was overpowered by his strength, and I gave up quickly, just hoping to not be any further harmed. David and the other man ran through the house, looting it of everything valuable, creating chaos and mess in all of the rooms. The man on top of me continued to hold me tightly, pushing my head into the hard wooden floor with all of his weight. After a few minutes, David called out by the front door, and the man got off of me and ran out of the house. I heard their truck pull out and speed off, as I laid on the ground in shock, pain, and terror. After a couple minutes, I gathered myself up and slowly stumbled to the front door to close and lock it. I called the cops soon after. To no one's surprise, David wasn't his real name, nor was the email or phone number attached to any identifiable person. They collected some fingerprints around the house and took pictures of their shoe prints on the ground, but the case ran cold with no suspects at all. The only thing they were able to identify was that the shoe prints left at my house were the same as ones left at someone else's house a few weeks ago during a similar attack and robbery. That person was also alone in their home. It's suspected that they try to find those who live alone, so obviously I kind of fucked myself over by telling the man about my roommate who had left. Either way, that experience has caused me a lot of stress and anger. I was blinded by the feeling of safety being in my own home and was taken advantage of because of it. Sites like Craigslist are dangerous, and people need to be more aware of the dangers of willingly inviting unknown, seemingly innocent people into their homes. I tried buying a truck off of Craigslist some years ago, and before you say anything, it was a great price and I wasn't in the best financial situation. I'd never actually used Craigslist before, but I knew it was an average place for people to sell their stuff, which meant that it was usually cheap. Even with the cheap prices of cars on the site, I still had to ask my dad for money because I didn't even have the few $1,000s in my account that I needed in cash for a cheap car. After a bit of scrolling though, I messaged this guy who posted his truck for $4,000 and he got back pretty quickly, answering all of my questions on it and giving what sounded like honest answers. He basically said that it wasn't the nicest looking, but it'll get you where you gotta be in a reliable manner. Interested, he agreed to meet me at a Burger King that was a halfway point of where we both lived. I got there first, taking an Uber, and he showed up maybe 5 minutes later. We chatted for a bit, and he told me more about the truck, mentioning minor issues it's given him in the past, but nothing too serious. After all, I didn't have the money to be picky. Of course, I asked if I could test drive it, to which he said that he knew a less busy parking lot and I could test drive it there. Honestly, I was like, alright, whatever, and I took my phone out to get a quick Uber, but he said it was just across the street and that we could just ride together. I didn't want to be rude and had never done something like this before, so I kind of assumed it was a normal thing. Looking back, I should have told him to F off, but I was young and he was old, so for some reason I trusted him. As I got inside, he asked me if I had my license on me, which was just another reason I trusted him. He seemed like he was a genuine guy. He started driving, though we went a little further than across the street, probably a few blocks away from the Burger King, to this empty parking lot away from the main road, which was the first red flag to come up, even though it should have been the second or third. "Alright, let's switch," he said, putting the car in park. As we were passing each other around the car, he threw me the keys, saying heads up, but they landed nowhere near me. I mean, I would have had to dive into the concrete to catch them. Awkwardly, I went to pick them up, and just as I bent down, I felt the weight of his foot slam against my side, and before I knew it, he was on top of me, ripping my wallet out of my back pocket and running back towards the truck. I immediately grabbed the keys from the ground, thinking he must have forgotten them in the heat of the moment, and that I could possibly force a trade. Unfortunately though, the keys he threw at me must have just been fake, because he just drove away, leaving me stranded there stupidly. What makes everything worse is that it all happened so fast I couldn't even get the damn license plate. I still had my phone though, and the first thing I did was cancel the only card I had because I couldn't risk him spending money I didn't have, and then I called the police. I walked back to the Burger King and filed a report when they met me there, but with only the description of a rusty white truck and an average middle-aged white guy, Nothing ever came of it. He took the ad down, and his email wasn't even a real name. Apparently it was just named after a video game character, and again, I didn't get his plates. So all in all, I lost $4,000 of straight cash, had to wait for a new card in the mail, had to get a new license, and they didn't even catch the guy. Moral of the story is, don't use Craigslist, and don't be as stupid as I was. I used to work for a big maid company, but I left after my ex-coworker told me that she was making more than triple just working by herself and listing ads on Craigslist Marketplace. So of course, I looked into it and eventually began doing that as well. I was making amazing money for close to 7 months before anything weird happened. Ever since, I have never encountered someone that creepy, and I hope I never do again. I had answered a usual email from someone asking me to clean their house. The way it works is they tell me what rooms they want me to do, and I charge the price based on how long I think it will take. To do this, I have to go to their house to make an estimate, or they can send me a video walkthrough. This is the way we did it at my old company, except I charge a much better price, and people feel more comfortable with the same person coming over every week. The man had sent me a video walkthrough of his house, and it was very clean already, which happens with a lot of clients who just want to maintain that cleanliness and have someone get the nitty-gritties. We set a date and time, and a few days later I went for the first time clean. I was going to be there for about 3.5 hours, doing the top and bottom floor, no basement, and giving extra care to the kitchen and bathroom tiles. He greeted me at the door and led me upstairs so I can work my way down, and this is where everything went to shit. I began cleaning, expecting him to leave, but he kind of just stands there watching me, which I sometimes have happen with older women who are control freaks, but this guy wasn't looking at what I was cleaning, he was eyeing me. I ask him if he wants me to do anything else, and he just stands there for a second.
You know, when I saw your ad on Craigslist, I knew I had to have you.
At first, I didn't think of this in any kind of flirty way. I just saw this as some older white guy telling me, a Mexican woman, that I was meant to be good at cleaning. I didn't really care. I've heard it all the time. They usually just say things out of ignorance. But I wanted the money, so I kept my mouth shut and faked a response.
Oh, well, thank you. I usually ask that people stay out of the room, though. It's just easier to clean that way.
He said no problem, but clearly there was, because while he left that room, he went to the room just across the hallway and sat on the bed and watched me from there. At this point, I was getting creeped out, and the thought of him watching me for 3.5 hours was very unsettling. I had an idea, and after I dusted, I started to vacuum, going behind the door so I could move it, leaving it only cracked open slightly, so that for the rest of this room at least, he wouldn't be able to look at me. I just had to get through this day, get paid, and never come here again. I moved to the bathroom that was connected to the room. I was about 20 minutes in, and scrubbing grout when I felt that I was being looked at again. I turned around, and sure enough, he was there in the doorway.
Sorry to bother you. I forgot to tell you to leave the vanity as is. It was my wife's. She died years ago in '09. It's been really rough going through all that, so I want to preserve it.
I said okay, and after a moment of silence and awkward staring, he finally left. I wondered why he didn't just put in special instructions to not touch the master bathroom vanity if it were so important. But as I was cleaning around it, I noticed there was some makeup on the counter that I knew had only come out a few years ago. This was 2017, and he said his wife died in 2009, but the makeup lying on the counter had a few products that came out no earlier than 2015, and I knew this because I was excited when they came out. And for what it's worth, if this vanity had been preserved, it would have looked a lot worse. If I wasn't sketched out before, I definitely was now. Thankfully, for the rest of the time I was upstairs, he didn't look at me or talk to me. I was dreading going downstairs, but I was halfway done and just needed to get the rest of it over with. I got to the kitchen and started there. From the kitchen, you could see the living room, and again, something was off. This guy had 0 pictures hanging up. I've cleaned so many homes, hundreds at this point, and I've never seen a house with no pictures. Even people that lived alone had at least holiday cards of other people's families on their fridge. I don't know why it freaked me out so much, but it did. And right when I decided I was just going to do the rest really fast and cut some of the cost for him, he appeared in the archway and asked if I could do him a favor. I hesitantly asked what, to which he said he knows it specifically says no basement, but he forgot he's having guests over next week, and that was where the pool table and everything was, and he just wants it quickly vacuumed. I told him I was on a really tight schedule and wasn't sure if I could do it today, but maybe next time. He then said I could skip the dining room because it's never in use and just do the basement floors instead. I responded, explaining that I could come back tomorrow and do the whole basement instead of just the floors if he wanted, just trying to push it off a little bit. But this was when his whole demeanor changed. He started to get really weird and said that he just wants the floor done and he couldn't understand why I wouldn't just do it today. He went on to say that he and his wife really needed the floors done down there. His wife? The one that had died years ago. That was the moment I realized that this guy was clearly trying to do something horrible, but I didn't know what. I told him, if I have time I will.
Well, can I just show you what needs to get done down there? It won't take long, just really quick.
Knowing he wasn't going to stop, I pretended to get a phone call, so I went to the other room. I then called my friend to explain what was happening. He was still watching me carefully, so I spoke in Spanish, praying he didn't know any. She agreed to drive to this address and make sure when I left he didn't try to follow me, or worse. I got off the phone and told him that I had a family emergency and I could come back tomorrow to finish everything, which was obviously a lie. He looked at me with the coldest look on his face and replied,
"Don't bother."
Then he walked upstairs while I gathered my things. I knew I wasn't going to get paid, but at this point I just felt lucky to leave. My friend got there while I was loading my trunk, and the guy was staring at me through the window the entire time. I left, and when I got home I called the police to tell them what happened, but there wasn't much they can do, since he didn't break the law, he was just being creepy. They basically just told me the obvious, to not go there again, which I clearly wasn't going to. Just a reminder for everyone, if you provide a service through sites like Craigslist, there's no sure way to tell who's weird and who's not. So make sure to trust your gut and always let someone know the address you're going to and when you're supposed to leave, just in case. I don't know what was wrong with that guy or what he had planned for me in that basement, but I hope nobody else has to find out. I was driving home from my friend's house. It was late. I don't know exactly the time, but if I had to guess, it was probably 2 or 3 a.m. I lived 20 minutes away, which wasn't too far, since most houses around here are spread out. The rain and lack of streetlights made it hard to see though, so I was driving slower and more carefully. 5 minutes down the road, I pulled up to a traffic light. I had the red light, but there was a blue car on the other side who was on the road, partially in the intersection. Its headlights and everything were on, but it was just sitting there at a green light. I couldn't tell if there was something wrong, or maybe they were asleep, but when the lights changed, I drove forward, slowly maneuvering around them. I tried to discreetly look in their car as I passed, but the rain on my window blocked most of my view. Only a moment after passing them and driving down the road again, the blue car turned and started following me down the road, so it wasn't broken down after all. I kept my eye on the mirrors. I wouldn't consider myself a paranoid person, but the situation felt staged. Another minute down the road, the car's headlights started getting brighter in my mirrors as they pulled their car closer to what felt like just a couple of feet from my back bumper. In weather like this, that made me really uncomfortable. I looked back at the road, but saw a small light pop up on my dashboard. It was a signal that one of my tires was low on air. A common signal, but it felt like an odd time for it just to pop up, given the situation. I looked back in my mirrors, seeing the car still tailing me. They were so close, their headlights almost made it hard to even see the actual car. I was just 4 or 5 minutes away from home, nearing the entrance to the neighborhood, when my dashboard started flickering a new signal. Flat tire. My stomach dropped. The second I saw that signal, I put all the pieces together and was almost 100% sure that this car behind me had done something. I drove another minute, hoping to make it closer to home, but I could feel my car sinking to the left, and I was practically driving on the rims now. I had to pull over. The car behind me did the same. I should have called someone as soon as I parked, but I was so concerned and focused with what the person behind me was doing that it didn't even cross my mind. Though, even if I did call someone, it probably wouldn't have prevented what happened next. Once parked, 3 doors opened from the car and 3 men came out. I only had a few seconds to prepare and react, but I was helpless and defenseless. They ran up to my car, 2 on my side and 1 on the other. One of the men came right up to my window, yelling at me to open the door and pointing a gun at me. It happened so fast, I was just in some dazed state. I started to reach for the door, but the man by the back door smashed something against the window, shattering it, then reached his hand in and opened the back door. They were all still yelling, both at me and at each other. The man in the back reached across, opening the other back door, then reached in front of me to open my door. I was still just sitting there, holding my hands up now to show I wasn't a threat. I knew there was no way out of this, even if I did have a weapon. Once my door was open, the man with the gun pulled me out of the car and slammed me on the ground. The oddest thing is while I was on the ground, looking out into the rainy pavement, all I was thinking about was how cold and wet the pavement was. Not about how I had a gun being pushed into the back of my head, or that I was being robbed and beaten. I think it was my head trying to distance myself from the traumatizing situation I was in. I wasn't on the ground for long before the men by the car called out, and the guy holding me down hit me in the back of the head, causing me to ricochet off the pavement. I wasn't even sure if he hit me with the gun or just his fist, because I was already numb. I'm surprised it didn't knock me out, though. I heard their car doors close, and then driving away. I rolled over, still in a daze, and tried to pick myself up. They'd taken my phone, so I was forced to drive my car home and call the police when I got there, which ended up denting and damaging my rims anyway. The investigation went nowhere, determining only that the suspects had purposefully placed small tire spikes in the road at the intersection I crossed them at. I got lucky to have only hit 1 spike, and for it to have caused less damage than usual. They likely planned to ambush me as soon as I hit the trap, but in the end, it didn't make a difference. I'm 24, and I lived alone with my dog, Bear, in a cozy townhome up until 3 months ago. I moved in when I turned 22, having a decent enough job. I loved the home, being the first place I'd ever rented for myself, but 2 years of happy living was ruined by this one night. It was gloomy outside and raining quite a lot. It was my day off, so I was sitting on a chair in my living room, scrolling on my phone. It was 8 p.m., which was just an hour before I usually went to bed. Bear had been sitting by the back door for a while, looking outside. He started whining and ran up to me, which was his way of communicating to me that he needed to go outside. I got up and let him out, then closed the door and stood in the kitchen. While it was just a townhome, there was a small fence separating the backyards, so I didn't have to worry about Bear running away or anything. Also, I should mention that Bear isn't a large dog at all. He's just fluffy and small, like a teddy bear. Not long, maybe 15 or 20 seconds after I let him outside, I heard him whimper and bark. It was very clearly a cowering bark, like he was running away from something. It scared me, and I rushed to the door and looked out, seeing Bear running back towards me with his tail between his legs. Once he was inside, I leaned my head outside and scanned the backyard, expecting a coyote or something to be lurking by the fence, but nothing was there. I made sure Bear was okay, then locked up my door. He never does anything like that, so that made me really worried for him. I let him sit on my lap for the rest of the night. Through the next 30 minutes, he was constantly perking his head up and staring at the windows and doors, a different one each time. Then, after 45 minutes of sitting there, Bear turned his head and stared at the window behind me, lowering his ears and growling.
Bear?
I said, turning to look where he was looking, and right in the window, just a couple feet from us, was a man staring back at me. He was almost right up against the glass. I jumped up and screamed, stepping backwards as the man sprinted away down the side of the house. Bear started barking again from the sudden chaos. I closed the blinds and checked all of the others, making sure they were closed as well. From the quick glimpse I got, I didn't recognize the man. I didn't know who he was, or what he was doing here, or why he was staring at me. I tried to listen for any more indications that he was still around, but the rain outside was too loud, covering up any possible sounds. Bear seemed calmer though, so I stayed up for a while longer just to be safe, then went upstairs and had Bear sleep in my room with me. It took a long time for me to fall asleep, having a lot on my mind, but after an hour or so, I slowly dozed off. When I woke, Bear was standing up right by the bedroom door, staring at it. This was a freaky thing to see, waking up in the middle of the night, but not even seconds later, I heard something below me. A man talking. And not long after, a man on the other side of the house talking back. Their footsteps were loud, and they didn't even seem to be whispering either. It was like they didn't care if I knew that they were inside my home. My bedroom door was locked, but I had nowhere else to go. I went over to Bear quietly, trying to keep him calm, then picked him up and went over to the corner of my room, behind the bed. It took me a while to realize, but then it struck me that I hadn't heard any noises at all in the past minute. No steps or voices. This was when I took my phone out and called the police, whispering as softly as I could. As I told them my address, Bear started a low growl, then began barking and whining as two sets of footsteps started making their way up the stairs. I begged for the operator to send someone immediately. The two men started talking to each other again, but it was hard to make out their words.
Hey, we just want to talk. We're not here to hurt you.
I screamed, saying I called the cops and for them to leave. I was panicking, not knowing what else to do. There was a pause afterwards.
We're here to help you,
one of the men said. I didn't respond as I was busy trying to muffle my crying.
Open the door.
It got quiet again. I could only hear them breathing behind the door for what felt like a whole minute, before one of them walked back down the stairs. I couldn't tell where they went downstairs, or if they'd left or not, but I was sure that it was just one set of footsteps that left the bedroom door. It was so quiet though, and I couldn't hear any breathing. In the far distance, the soft sound of sirens started to get louder. A sense of safety was finally coming back. Once the sirens got closer, I heard footsteps running out of the house downstairs, but now I was unsure of where the other man was. It seemed really unlikely for him to be by my door still, but I could swear I'd never heard him leave. I waited for the police to pull up and make their way inside. I heard them searching downstairs, then slowly make their way upstairs and knock on my door. I almost didn't want to answer, still thinking that other man had to be somewhere nearby. When I opened the door though, it was just an officer. I immediately told him about my concerns. He directed me out of the house as one of his partners continued searching. but nobody was found. The only thing they were able to find was watery footprints all around the house, as well as an unlocked window, which, to be honest, I wasn't sure if I kept locked or not. It terrified me though, feeling so confident that the other man was still there, never hearing him leave, but then there being no trace of him. It made it impossible to sleep at night, having this feeling of someone still in the house, watching me. I moved out 3 months ago. It was too much stress on my mind, having a loose end like that, especially since neither of them were ever identified or arrested. There was no clear intention the men had either, which is just another question added to the list of uncertainty. Even now, living miles away in a new apartment, I still sometimes feel like I'm not alone. I work at a convenience store at the corner of a small shopping strip. It's basically a smaller, local version of a 7-Eleven. I worked morning shifts for a while, which started at 3 a.m. and ended at 1 p.m. I agreed to these shifts because they were always the slowest and required the least amount of work. All the parts of my job included tending to customers, filling the shelves, and taking out the trash, which pretty much meant I had nothing to do. It was the middle of winter at the time this happened, but I live in a warmer state, so it usually rains instead of snows. It was a light pour outside, but it was enough to keep most people away. On early mornings like these, I like to lean against the front of the building outside and smoke to pass the time. I wasn't supposed to, but there wasn't anyone to stop me. Along the shopping strip were maybe 8 or 9 other stores connected to ours. All of them were stores with normal hours, so none of them were ever open until around 6 or 7 in the morning. So, when I saw a car pull into the parking lot while I was smoking outside, I of course assumed they were coming to the convenience store. I burned out my cigarette and tossed it in the trash, then headed back inside and around the corner. There really was nothing to do, so I was just waiting for the customer to come in and leave so I could get back to being bored alone. After a few minutes of nobody coming in though, I walked back around the corner and checked outside the door. The car was still there, parked in a parking space nearby, but the headlights were off, and as far as I could tell, nobody was inside. Again, it was lightly raining outside, and all the other stores were still closed, so I was a bit confused as to where they went. I took one last look around, seeing nobody, then closed the door and went back inside. 30 more minutes of nothing went by, and I think I was just standing in the same spot behind the counter for the whole time, spacing out. I checked the time, seeing I'd only been at work for a little over an hour, and decided I should check the trash cans around the store and toss them in the dumpster out back. I walked around to each trash bin, putting the bag in the cart and replacing it with a new bag. As I was doing this, I heard a faint click sound come from outside. It sounded like something snapping or breaking, but between the rain hitting the roof and the sound being somewhat far away, it was impossible to tell what it was or where exactly it came from. In the moment it happened though, I barely even thought about it. It just didn't seem like anything worth thinking about, just another random sound these old buildings made. Once I filled the cart with all the trash bags, I rolled it into the back room and unlocked the back door that led to the dumpster. I sighed, seeing as the rain was pouring down harder now, of course, right when I actually needed to go outside. Regardless, I pushed the cart through the rain and over to the dumpster, which was directly across from the door. After tossing in all the trash, I turned back and started heading for the door, but I noticed something was out of place. The store directly connected to mine had its door wedged open. I'd never seen anyone there earlier than 6, so it made me think. I went back inside to get out of the rain and went out to the front door and looked at the other store's door. All the lights were off and it looked locked up and empty like it always was at this time. I thought for a few more minutes before figuring I had nothing better to do and went back outside by the dumpster and walked up to the open door. Again, all the lights were off, but it seemed to lead into a small closet-type room, which then had another door, probably leading to the main storeroom. I stepped inside, standing in between the doorway so as to not make it seem like I was trying to sneak in or something. Standing inside now, I could hear someone moving around in the other room, walking, opening drawers. It sounded like they were making a mess, which then got me thinking even more.
Hey, is everything okay in there?
I called out, hoping to get a reassuring response from a neighboring store worker. The noises stopped. I waited a few seconds before I realized that this was not normal and something was definitely wrong. I stepped back outside and into the rain. As I quickly made my way back to my store, I recognized something was missing from the door I had just left. It took a second to figure it out, but then I saw that there was no handle. It was just an empty hole where the handle and lock usually are. Then I looked down at the wedge that was holding the door open, seeing now that it was actually the broken door handle. I ran back into my store, locking all the doors, and called 911, as well as my store manager. Once I knew they were on their way, I went up to the wall connecting our stores and put my ear against it, listening to the suspected robbery taking place. Whoever it was had to have known that I called the police, because they were moving quickly now, running all around, tossing or knocking things over. After 30 seconds to a minute of this, I saw lights flash outside and heard sirens approaching the back of the building. The footsteps quickly moved to the back of the store before a bunch of loud yelling came, which I assume was the officers. I checked out the back door after a minute, seeing a less hectic scene, and walked out to talk to the officers. I thanked them for coming so quickly and gave them a statement. The man who was arrested was found with a pillowcase full of nearly $6,000 worth of stolen items. He also had an empty firearm, along with a variety of tools used to break down doors and locks. And, unknowing to me, he'd also broken into the store 2 spots down as well. It's unclear whether or not the man knew I was working at the time, but my store lights were on, so it isn't likely that he would have broken into my store. But several large scratches were found on the back of our door handle, which may have been from a previous attempt.